All right, while you're getting settled, I'll just kind of start. Good morning, first of all. I'm Ted Otto, representing the Adult Education Council. And I want to, before we get to today's program, just talk about the fact that after this week, we'll have a 3-week session with Jeff Doan and John Klum on James is the name of the book by Percival Everett. And I think a lot of you have read it, but if you read it in advance, it'll make for more meaningful discussions. I also want to announce before we get into the today's session that we're going to add a session. You know, we've had 3 sessions now, or this is the third. The first one was on resilience, and that was with Nanette Sawyer and Matt. And the second one was with Joe Morrow, and that was on respect, where we kind of looked at some of the teachings of the church. And today is going to be on resistance. But carrying out that theme, and because there's been a lot of interest, there's going to be a workshop that we're going to schedule on Saturday morning, the 22nd. And I want to get this right. Nanette and Joe and possibly another, and Nancy Benson Nicole will be leading that workshop. It'll be from 9 a.m. till noon on Saturday morning, the 22nd, 2 weeks from yesterday. The title is going to be Spiritual Resources for Resilience, Resistance, and Reconciliation. It's going to be right here in Borwell. The workshop will include guided meditations and other awareness practices, teaching about how our bodies handle emotional traumas and the healing responses we can foster, and an introduction to the idea of microactivism and how we can have a positive impact on things we care about through consistent actions based on love, compassion, and joy. So that'll be in the bulletin next week, but I wanted to have you put that on your calendar. So today we have our session on resistance. Rocky Supinger is the senior associate pastor, recently appointed that. He is just celebrating 9 years here at the church. I think all of you enjoy his preaching, and today you'll get an opportunity to hear him on this subject. So Rocky, that's enough for me. I think you ought to take over. Oh, I want to have prayer. I'm sorry for the most important thing. This is actually a prayer that Rocky put in a daily devotion. It is from Martin Luther King. Will you join me in prayer? Oh God, make us willing to do your will, come what may. Increase the number of persons of goodwill and moral sensitivity. Give us renewed confidence in nonviolence and the way of love as taught by Christ. Amen.
Amen. Thank you, Ted. Well, good morning, everybody. I'm really happy to be doing the third part of this class. Hello, everybody who's on Zoom. We do have people on Zoom, yes? All right, good. I have enjoyed looking at the things that Nanette and Matt and then Joe last week have done about this class, and I hope to keep the bar high for what they have done. So resistance is what we are talking about today. And I have one disclaimer, and then I'll just get right into it. I'm not an expert in resistance. You will not find me out in the street at protests very often. I have done that, but I'm not standing before you telling us as a church how we must resist. What I plan to share today is some of my understanding of the scriptures. Yeah, that's what Regan is for. The scriptures and our confessional tradition about this. And then I'm going to share some of the people that have influenced how I think about and practice this. So, since this class was conceived back after the election, let me just run through a few things that have occurred, and I hope this does not induce trauma. We've had an executive order declaring birthright citizenship invalid. We've had forced deportations of migrants to Guatemala, Mexico, El Salvador, and India, just to name a few places, and those deportations have used the United States military to carry them out. We've had executive orders rolling back protections for transgender people and terminating diversity, equity, and inclusion programs in the federal government. Public health information has simply disappeared from government websites, and staff have been threatened against using pronouns in their email signatures. We've had the announcement of a freeze on federal funding for all grants and loans, which threaten important programs for the hungry, like Meals on Wheels. The president casually declared that the United States was going to take over the Gaza Strip and forcibly relocate the Palestinians who are only just now returning there after 16 months of nonstop bombardment. We've had the suspension of all foreign aid and the dismantling or the attempted dismantling of USAID, which provides hunger and poverty relief all over the world. And we've had the creation of a task force announced at the prayer breakfast this last week to root out anti-Christian bias in the United States. So given all this, I don't know about you, but this is kind of how I feel.
So, I want you to get up now. I want all of you to get up out of your chairs. I want you to get up right now and go to the window, open it, and stick your head out and yell, "I'm as mad as hell, and I'm not going to take this anymore!"
Very good. Thank you. All right. I knew I wanted to use that clip, and then I went back and I rewatched Network this last week. It holds up. Really ahead of its time. So I want to resist all these things that I just listed off, and I know that you do as well. I want the church to be a force for resistance against things like this. I grew up learning about how Christian citizens in the middle of the century in Germany and Italy permitted or actively abetted the rise of murderous fascism in Europe. And I don't want to be a part of that, and I don't want the church to be a part of that. And that may feel to some like I'm stating things too dramatically. There are certainly Christians who would not state things that way. I feel like it's important to name up front that the posture that I have and the desire that I think many of us in this room share to resist the things that I just listed, not every Christian in the United States feels that way about what's going on, right? Nod your head if you're with me. More Christians than us are actually okay. Some are thrilled with what is going on. There is sort of a trend in evangelical Christian publishing against empathy. There's a book coming out called Toxic Empathy. So like, I just feel like it's important to say we're here because we as individuals and we are part of a church that has values of taking care of people, that values caring for and coming alongside the poor and the marginalized, and that has a suspicious posture perhaps towards governmental authority in the way that I just listed out. So I just want to say that I said I wasn't going to do a bunch of disclaimers, and here I go. So we have some resistance that has already started, right? There are signs of resistance in the church even. There are signs of resistance in the church. I know many of you will probably have heard the sermon from Bishop Buddy on the day after the inauguration. The Associated Press has done some reporting on churches and clergy across the country making plans to resist mass immigration orders. Here at Fourth, we very quickly formed a plan for what we would do as staff and volunteers should ICE agents enter the building on a Sunday or during the week and wish to speak to someone or be looking for someone. We as a staff talked about it. We spoke to some trustees who have some know-how about this and know the law. And like we made a plan. We know what we will do. On top of that, our World Mission and Social Justice Committee is going to have this conversation about what our response ought to be, particularly with this question, and they may have some recommendations for the session. So I know it can feel at a time like this like everything's coming at us and nothing is happening in response. There are things happening in response, even in the church. Also outside the church, you had a lawsuit filed challenging the ban on transgender troops. PFLAG filed a suit against the executive order that narrowly defined sexes and halted federal support for gender-affirming care for people under 19. There's a lawsuit challenging that. 18 state attorneys general, including Kwame Raoul in Illinois, have filed suit to block the executive order about birthright citizenship, and that has been blocked by a judge. A coalition of nonprofit organizations has sued to block the federal grant and loan freeze. A judge temporarily blocked the firing of USAID staff. There's more. The things that feel like they're coming at us every day, multiple things every day, they are not proceeding unimpeded. That is not to say that we don't take them seriously and are not alarmed by them. But I have detected in the last week this kind of panicky sense, particularly on the pages of the New York Times, of like, where is the resistance to this? And I read something yesterday that was written by Ross Barkin in the New York Times Magazine that helped me take a couple of breaths. And I'll just share it with you by way of some of the things that are already happening. He wrote, what comes next might be a more conventional politics, one grounded in resistance, but perhaps of a quieter type. When Trump signed his executive order to end birthright citizenship, the governors and attorney general of more than 20 states sued to stop him. Mass protest wasn't required, nor were calls for a fresh anti-fascist movement. The work was merely done. Democrats seem to be saying implicitly that this was enough. Action without performance. Now, I don't know that I agree with all of that, and it's not simply a Republican versus Democrat issue. We're in the church. But it helped me think about there is resistance happening, that if we are looking as the only sign that will satisfy us for resistance, for mass protests in the streets, we may not be seeing a lot of, that's happening. There have been demonstrations in Chicago in the last couple of weeks. Yesterday, in fact. But there's also lots of other stuff happening that we may not be seeing that is resistance, right? So I just feel like I want to name that up front. So here's kind of where we're going to go today. I want to do an overview of my reading of resistance as it shows up in the biblical narrative. That'll be fairly quick. Also, our confessions, how they talk about resistance. And then there's 4 things that I want to share from my own experience. So not my own experience of Martin Luther King, but things that have influenced me. So Martin Luther King is in there. I'm going to talk about some of my time in Northern Ireland and the things that I saw and learned there. Also, some stuff from the sanctuary movement on the U.S.-Mexico border in the early 1980s. Many of you will know more about these things than I do. And then relationship is resistance. I have been really influenced by the Industrial Areas Foundation community organizing framework, and that has shaped a lot of how I think about this. And then Moms Resist. Meredith Clayton, my wife, was involved in a situation around the travel ban back in 2017 and sponsoring a family from Syria. And she was going to be here to talk about that. Wasn't able to be here. So if we have time, I will give you the junior varsity version of that. So quickly, resistance in the Bible. We start, or I start anyway, the Exodus story, right? This is the first case in the biblical narrative where a people is under the thumb of a power that they must resist. And it starts right at the beginning. A new king arose who did not know Joseph. The Israelites had been in Egypt at the end of Genesis. Joseph and his whole family went there. And now you find out there's a new king. They lost an election. The guy in charge doesn't care for them. And the circumstances are bad. It's forced labor, and it's really terrible. And the course of that story is that God delivers that people. God calls forth a prophet, Moses, right? And Moses goes and stands toe-to-toe with power and says, God says, let my people go. This is significant because Moses is raised in the king's household. And Moses makes a decision to identify himself actually with this oppressed people and go confront the power structure at great risk to his own life to say, let my people go. Of course, you know the story. Pharaoh doesn't do that. What results is that the people are delivered. God delivers them. So for me, the first story of resistance in the biblical narrative is God resisting the enslaving power of the Pharaoh and delivering God's people. This is not a story in which God's people protest in the streets. In fact, they actively resist God's deliverance of them at certain points. In the wilderness wandering, you hear these complaints about, can we go back to Egypt? There was food there, like we had a bed. There were certain things about captivity that we weren't all that upset about compared to this, especially, right? So, first instance of resistance in the narrative that catches my attention, God delivers people. Amen? So this is going to tip into preaching a little bit. Okay, so the next thing you look at, or that I look at, is the exile story, right? So the Israelites get their own land, they get their own government, they're self-determined, they have a king, it's great, and then things go sideways, and there's a civil war, and they divide into a northern and a southern half, and eventually the Assyrians come and conquer the northern kingdom, and the Babylonians conquer the southern kingdom and take people off into exile. And there's a lot in the Old Testament about the Babylonian exile. The book of Daniel has this story that you probably learned in Sunday school about Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, right? So the king of Babylon has this statue built. It's made of gold, 90 feet tall, 9 feet wide, whatever, and says, when you hear trumpets play, everybody bow down and worship this statue. And Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego do not do that. They're thrown into a fiery furnace, but the flames don't harm them. Now, when I was a kid in an evangelical church, we were into Christian rock music. And there was a great song about this. So here's the chorus. All alone, and they say, not gonna bow to your idol. We won't bow, oh no. No. Okay, not gonna bow to your idol. And I'm just gonna say personally, over the last 8 years, it has saddened me that the people who taught me that, many of them, have gone headlong into what looks like idolatry. I'll just leave that there. So that's the exile. Resistance by refusing to participate in what the power demands you to do. You with me? Okay. That is one voice in exile. Another prominent voice from the exile is actually doesn't look like resistance at all. And I think it's important to name that. So you have this word of God through the prophet Jeremiah to the exiles to seek the welfare of the city where I've sent you into exile. That does not sound like tear it all down. That does not sound like fight back. The text goes on to say, plant gardens, marry your kids off here. You're going to be here for a while. And in this city's well-being, you're going to find your well-being. That's an important sort of counter voice. And then you get to Jesus. So Jesus very famously says this, don't resist an evildoer. Do not resist. That's hard. If anyone strikes you on the right cheek, turn the other also. Went on to say, if somebody takes your cloak, give them your shirt as well. If they force you to go a mile, and this is an allusion to military conscription, citizens or non-citizens could be forced by a soldier to carry their stuff. If they force you to carry it a mile, Jesus said, carry it 2 miles. It's a hard thing to hear. It doesn't feel like resistance. It's resistance as loving your enemies. Some people have said that loving your enemies is the core of Jesus' teaching, even about resistance. So I want to do questions at the end when everybody can be heard. So okay, thank you, Margaret. And then Jesus owned, did I skip one? There we go. When Jesus was arrested, if there was going to be armed resistance, this was going to be the moment, and one of his disciples took a sword to one of the high priest's servants, and Jesus told him to put the sword away. All who take the sword will die by the sword. That's Matthew's version. You know, biblical scholars may point out that's not in Mark or Luke or John, but it is in Matthew. And then Jesus has his day in court, and Pilate essentially begs Jesus to offer some defense so that Pilate can let him go, and he won't do it. He gives no answer, not even to a single charge, so that the governor was greatly amazed. Jesus' resistance by not offering a defense of himself. And of course, Jesus ends up a victim of state-sanctioned violence. The story is not, that's not the end of the story though, is it? The resurrection is the heart of our story. The resurrection seems to me to be about resistance by God defeating the powers of evil and death in the world. And there's more that could be said about that. But the epistles of Paul are a bit of a problem when it comes to talking about resistance. Paul was a Roman citizen. Paul was a Pharisee. Paul had what was probably the most common view of his day about the relationship of faith to the state. Whoever resists authority resists what God has appointed, and those who resist will incur judgment. It's in there. The letter to the Ephesians then points out that we're struggling not against enemies of blood and flesh, but against the rulers, against the authorities, against the cosmic powers of this present darkness, against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly places. What we are resisting is not just a person who occupies a position of power. What we are resisting is not just a government. Paul says it's spiritual. There are spiritual forces here at work. The contemporary American theologian Walter Wink has written a lot about this. The book called The Principalities and the Powers is very helpful for thinking about when we find ourselves in a position where our conscience and our faith compels us to resist, to recall that there's a spiritual element to resistance, right? That's important to keep in mind. And then I wanted to check in on Revelation. So the apocalypse of Revelation is addressed to a Christian community that is facing oppression and persecution, and it is this fantastic vision of an alternative future that God has for them, the great dragon being thrown down. This feels to me a lot more like Exodus, the people of faith entrusting themselves to God's deliverance. That there is evil in the world and it is assaulting you, and that is the perspective of the apocalypse. It's not that you're concerned about other people, it's us. We are being mistreated, we are being persecuted, and the vision, apocalyptic vision of the New Testament is, this is not how it's going to end. God has a vision for the future that is not this. And that seems to me to be fuel for resistance. But it is not, tellingly, Revelation is not a vision of the early Christians fighting back. So, okay, I want to check in on the confessions really quickly. So we have a book of confessions. You all probably know this, not just one statement of faith. Our theological guidance and authority comes from a collection of statements across centuries and different contexts. And the earliest of those contexts were a state church, right? So the Scots Confession comes out of the church in Scotland, like the mother country for Presbyterians, and this was adopted by the National Assembly. This was not the church saying something to the rest of the culture. This was the government. It is a sin to obey or resist any whom God has placed in authority. Tellingly, though, so long as they do not exceed the bounds of their office. I never noticed that before preparing this class. That's a very important caveat, isn't it? Okay, the Theological Declaration of Barmen, many of you will be familiar with this, was composed in 1934 by pastors and theologians in Germany trying to voice a response to the ascendant Nazi ideology and the location of God's will and purpose in the Nazi movement, where they said outright, we reject the false doctrine as though the church could and would have to acknowledge as a source of its proclamation, apart from and besides this one word of God, still other events and powers, figures, and truths. In other words, Hitler is not God's will. We resist that. We reject that. We look to Jesus, and that's it. Jesus is our ultimate final authority for what God's will is, right? The Barmen Declaration, I think this church, we've talked about this a lot. It comes up a lot. Okay. Then in 1967, this is when actually the Presbyterian Church said, we are going to have all these statements of faith as our theological authority. This is when the Book of Confessions was created. And you can hear the influence of the Barmen Declaration in this statement of faith that the American Presbyterian Church created in 1967. Although nations may serve God's purposes in history, the church which identifies the sovereignty of any one nation or any one way of life with the cause of God denies the lordship of Christ and betrays its calling. We don't identify national purposes with God's purposes. And the church that, so this is as direct a statement as you will find in our Book of Confessions against Christian nationalism, the very idea that there would be a Christian nationalism, right? And then this is really amazing. So within the last decade, we added this confession to our Book of Confessions. It comes out of the Dutch Reformed Church in South Africa, the context of apartheid in 1986. And check this out. We reject any ideology which would legitimate forms of injustice and any doctrine which is unwilling to resist such an ideology in the name of the gospel. So you have gone from it's a sin to resist authority to we reject a doctrine that's unwilling to resist an ideology that legitimates injustice in the name of the gospel. This is all in our Book of Confessions. This, I think, is really stunning. It's a pretty far-reaching thing to say, if you're going to say that we're not willing to resist any ideology that enshrines injustice because, that's politics and the church is the church, keep them separate. This says that's wrong, and we reject and resist that. Unwillingness to resist is called out, the word's not used, but called out as sin, right? We have to be willing to resist the legitimation of injustice. This is part of our church heritage. Okay, having said all that, this is important to note as well. This is a Sloane from William Sloane Coffin. The German church learned too late it's not enough to resist with confessions. We must confess with resistance. I am one who is guilty of leaning heavily on these confessions. But it says, this is our theology. And Coffin was sort of like, okay, what are you going to do with that? Now, Cynthia Jarvis is a Presbyterian pastor. She posted this on Facebook yesterday. This was not in my original slide deck. I went looking for attribution of an original source of this from Coffin. Couldn't find it. I like the quote anyway. I'm using it. Challenge me. I dare you. It is not enough to resist with confessions. We must confess with resistance. So I want us to know what Scripture, the biblical narrative, the picture that it paints about this. I want us to know what our church has said about resistance over the years. But at the end of the day, I think we need to be constructive and imaginative in thinking about how we do that. So here we're going to get into the things that have really influenced me. So here's the first one.
Nonviolent resistance is the most potent weapon available to oppressed people in their struggle for freedom and justice. I think the aftermath is much greater for everybody involved. The aftermath of violence is bitterness, and you've got to spend another 100 years getting rid of the bitterness created as a result of the violent revolution. Wherein the aftermath of nonviolence is redemption and the possibility of the creation of the beloved community.
Okay. So this is sort of a starting point for me in thinking about resistance and what it needs to look like, that nonviolence is kind of a non-negotiable for us, right? I've spent a lot of time in the last few months reading the collection of King's sermons called Strength to Love that were delivered around the time of the Montgomery bus boycott. So I'll share some of the things that really captured my attention from those as it relates to resistance. King was not sanguine about evil, right? He said evil is recalcitrant and determined and never voluntarily relinquishes its hold short of a persistent, almost fanatical resistance. And when you think about King and the leaders of the civil rights movement and everybody who was involved in that, that was what they were accused of, was being fanatics, right? And I think King would say, yeah, that's right, because evil doesn't just give up. But the fanatical character of that resistance was not violent. In his sermon called Pilgrimage to Nonviolence, he talks about his relationship with liberal theology. And this is, I'll read you the longer quote. He preached, "I began to question the liberal doctrine of man. That is, that progress is inevitable, that people are inherently good and things are just going to get better. The more I observed the tragedies of history and people's shameful inclination to choose the low road, the more I came to see the depths and strength of sin. My reading of the works of Reinhold Niebuhr made me aware of the complexity of human motives and the reality of sin on every level of human existence. Moreover, I came to recognize the complexity of people's social involvement and the glaring reality of collective evil. I realized that liberalism had been all too sentimental concerning human nature and that it leaned toward a false idealism." King's approach to resistance was very realistic, which is why I think he said things like this in the sermon, "A Tough Mind and a Tender Heart." Through nonviolent resistance, we shall be able to oppose the unjust system and at the same time love the perpetrators of the system. We must work passionately and unrelentingly for full stature as citizens, but may it never be said, my friends, that to gain it we used inferior methods of falsehood, malice, hate, and violence. This is bedrock for me, right? And it is so hard. The resistance that often is called for in the midst of trying to resist evil is to resist the parallel evil of meeting violence with violence. The charge that we often hear at the end of a worship service, return no one evil for evil, that I think is at the heart of this. I meant to say something earlier when I was talking about the Bible, and I'm going to take occasion here to do it. The inferior methods of falsehood. So you guys know the story in Exodus of Shiphrah and Puah, the Hebrew midwives? So the king gives this order that all Hebrew male babies are to be thrown into the river. And then you get this funny little story about Shiphrah and Puah, these Hebrew midwives who don't do it, who refuse to do it. And the king finds out and says, "Why aren't you doing this?" And they say, "Well, the Hebrew women are just much more vigorous than the Egyptian women. They give birth before the midwife can get there." Totally made up story. It's a lie. And they're celebrated as heroes. So even something like this, inferior methods of falsehood, malice, hate, and violence, there's a tension, right? There's even in the biblical story, you have people lifted up who worked for the deliverance of God's people through methods that the storyteller of Exodus doesn't have a problem with it. So that's not where I meant to put that, but there it is. Okay, so let me talk now about my personal experience. So I had hair at one point. This is so right after college, I went for a year and was a full-time church volunteer through a program that we have in our denomination called the Young Adult Volunteer Program. Hardy Kim had also done this. He'd actually done it the same place I'd done it the year before me, and we didn't know that about each other until we met here. So this was in 1998. It was about 6 months after the Good Friday Peace Agreement had been signed. And I lived in this ecumenical community called the Cornerstone Community. These folks, Protestants and Catholics, had for years been meeting together. They bought a house on a road that was an interface between a Catholic neighborhood, the Falls neighborhood in front of them, and the Shankill Protestant neighborhood behind them. And that was their house right there on the road. Now, they didn't all live in the house. The volunteers and Isabel to my right there, she lived in the house, but everybody else, they lived where they lived, and then they would come together for a weekly meeting. These were pastors, they were teachers, they were priests, and their work was to model peacemaking. So they would go to funerals of Protestants and Catholics, and they would go in pairs. A Protestant and a Catholic would go together to a Protestant funeral or a Catholic funeral. If you know anything about the Troubles, this was very dangerous. It was awful. One of the people who you're going to hear from in a second was a priest from the monastery down the street named Jerry, Father Jerry Reynolds, and I was in that community with him for a whole year. So raise your hand if you recognize this picture. Okay, good. So I can tell you about it. This is Father Alec Reed, and by the way, this picture is cropped. So this is one of the most powerful pictures that came out of the struggle in Northern Ireland. So what happened here was there was a funeral. Okay, IRA members were shot in Gibraltar by the British government. At their funeral in Belfast, in the cemetery, a gunman named Michael Stone fired on the crowd of funeral mourners and threw grenades at them and killed several people. At those people's funeral procession down the street in Belfast, two plainclothes British Army corporals accidentally drove into the crowd. And people freaked out, and they pulled them from their cars, and they took them to a park. Father Alec Reed was there. He followed the people who took these soldiers. They laid the soldiers face down on the ground, and Father Alec Reed laid down in between them and put his arms over them. Keep in mind, the people in his own community are the ones who are threatening these men. He's a Catholic. These are Catholic nationalist folks. And the soldiers on the ground are the enemy. The soldiers on the ground are what you are resisting, right? Their oppression of you if you're a nationalist. So they threatened Alec Reed so that he got up and left, and he heard two gunshots and knew the soldiers had been shot. And he went back into the park and administered last rites to these soldiers. In fact, one of them he thought was still breathing, and he tried to give the kiss of life, which is why you see blood on his face. And there happened to be a photographer nearby that snapped this picture. So the community that I lived in, Cornerstone, would sometimes be a clandestine meeting space for meetings that Father Alec Reed would organize. It was very risky what he did. It was very risky what he was doing here. The people who shot these soldiers were going to shoot him if he didn't move. And yet his calling as a priest, but I think more fundamentally as a Christian, was to resist the murderous impulse even in the service of your own people, right? So there is a little clip of a film that was made about him. This is Father Jerry, who's talking about this.
I think the photograph is an image of an aspect of the mission of the church. And also, I mean, it was an image of the Beatitudes that Jesus speaks about. Blessed are the poor in spirit, theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the land. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for justice, for they shall be satisfied. You know, blessed are the pure in heart, they will see God. Blessed are the peacemakers, they will be called children of God. Those Beatitudes are, in a way, the weapons of the peacemaker who is following in the way of Christ. It's not an armory, it's not a weaponry, but it's a quality of soul and character and mind and heart, that enables one to, for the long haul of helping to bring people together in peace and justice.
So what's always been compelling to me about that story and about Father Alec Reed, and Father Jerry puts this beautifully, it's the long haul, a peacemaking orientation to resistance that bears in mind that there's going to be an after whatever we do now, right? And we need to be concerned about the after. It's about the long haul. So that's very heavy. And I have a couple more things I want to get to, so I'm sorry, but I'm just going to jump ahead. So this is John Fife. Raise your hand if you know who John Fife is. Come on, Jeff, you know John Fife. Okay, so this has been another really influential thing for me in thinking about resistance. So the book that's on the left, Everyone Who Is Gone Is Here by Jonathan Blitzer, is a great book. He writes a lot about John Fife in this book. So this was in the early 80s. This is how Jonathan Blitzer describes John Fife. A 40-year-old pastor with a salt and pepper beard and a penchant for cowboy boots and turquoise belt buckles. At 6 feet 4 inches tall, he was a towering, charismatic presence who resembled, in the words of the journalist Ann Crittenden, a cowboy dressed in clerical drag. I think that's fun. Okay, so here's how John Fife and his church got involved in resistance. So there was this terrible disaster in the Organ Pipe Cactus National Monument in Arizona. El Salvadoran refugees who were heading to the United States for political asylum got lost, and half of them died. And the other half, who, when they were picked up by the Border Patrol, were taken to hospital, and they wanted to see a pastor. And so somebody called John Fife, because he spoke a little Spanish, and he went to the church thinking that he was just going to say some prayers with them. But he heard their whole story, and he was shocked and appalled about what he learned was happening in El Salvador, which the American government was involved in supporting a military dictatorship in El Salvador, and that military dictatorship was in a fight with rebels. There you go. I can't read that right now, but thank you, Betsy. And so he kind of did everything he could to learn everything he could about what was going on. And there was another person, a Quaker named James Corbett, who got involved with him. John went to the local INS office, the Immigration Naturalization Service, and he had a very amicable conversation with the director there and said, what do we do? How do we help people? And that person said, well, we have political asylum in this country. You can help people apply for political asylum. And so that's what Fife and Corbett did. They started to process people's applications from El Salvador for political asylum because they were in detention. They were being detained. And so a lot of people started getting released as part of their asylum applications. They started to participate in the life of his church, Southside Presbyterian Church in Tucson. But the problem happened that all of the asylum applications were denied. They were all being denied. And so Fife and Corbett and the other people involved with them decided that what they had to do was to create an underground coyote network, that they were going to smuggle people, which was blatantly illegal. But they decided that there was no way that they could stand by and not do that. The way Blitzer puts it in the conversation, or in the book, they had a conversation in which they said they didn't want to get it wrong. They didn't want the church to get this wrong, the way the church had got it wrong in Germany. They saw them as equivalent. And so they were discovered, that what they were doing was discovered. An INS agent came to them and said, we know what you're doing. And so here's what John Fife did. He went to his congregation during their annual meeting. Our annual meeting is today. This is what Blitzer writes. In January, at the annual meeting of his congregation, Fife brought the proposal up that they would actually harbor people and provide them with sanctuary. They were confident that authorities would not arrest people in churches. So they said, okay, we will hide them in our churches. So they brought it up to a proposal for the whole congregation. He didn't ask just the session to decide about this. He said the congregation needs to vote on this. So there were lots of questions. Was it possible the whole church might be prosecuted for breaking the law? He had to admit he wasn't sure. Could other churches join Southside? He said he hadn't thought of that. He thought it was a great idea. After many hours of discussion, remember that during the meeting today, after many hours of discussion, followed by a secret ballot, the proposition passed with 59 people in favor, 2 against, and 4 abstentions. A small congregation. And so this is what they did. Of course, Fife and Corbett and several others were arrested and tried for aiding human smuggling, and they were found guilty of criminal conspiracy to smuggle and harbor migrants, and they were sentenced to probation. So this is a pretty compelling thing. The first mission trip I ever led with youth was in 2009, and we went to Tucson and we worshiped at Southside Church, and we heard this story a little bit. Fife was he the moderator of the General Assembly? Yeah, he became the moderator of the General Assembly. I'm confident John Buchanan and he were friends. But it's not just about him. It's about a congregation. A congregation made a commitment that they were going to harbor people, and they did in the church building. this has come up in recent weeks, right? Because you've heard people saying that, oh no, we will arrest people in churches. So I mentioned earlier that our staff had a conversation about what to do if ICE agents show up here. And the decision that we've kind of come to is that our staff, we have designated people on the staff, pastors, Andrea Denny, who will come down and talk to anybody who's here. And if they have a signed criminal warrant, we feel like we have to let them in. But if they don't, we're going to tell them to leave. It feels like a stopgap, but also feels like maybe this is not the most likely scenario that ICE agents are going to come into Fourth Presbyterian Church. Perhaps a year ago, they might have done that. But it's good for us to, it's a good conversation to have. How will we respond to this? Okay. So one more thing I want to share. This is my daughter, Laura. Her sign says no diesel trucks. This is when she was 4. I took her to a protest. The Industrial Areas Foundation, raise your hand if you know what that is. Saul Alinsky is a name that a lot of people in Chicago will know. So this has really been influential for me. The congregation I served in Claremont, California was part of a new chapter of the Industrial Areas Foundation called the Inland Empire Sponsoring Committee, and this was one of the first actions that we got involved in. The waste management company was proposing to build a waste transfer station where the garbage trucks come dump all the garbage and then it's transferred somewhere else in the middle of a neighborhood in the city to the south of us called Pomona, where there was like 3 elementary schools within 2 miles. And so we were resisting that. But the way that the Industrial Areas Foundation does resistance is through relationship. After Saul Alinsky was in charge of it, a guy named Edward Chambers came to be the head of it, and he kind of changed the philosophy of what they about what they did. This is one of the things that Chambers writes in his book Roots for Radicals. The foundational conviction of the IAF organizing tradition is that it is the fate of human beings to exist in between the world as it is and the world as it should be. Reflective people of conscience are constantly and painfully aware of the gap between our so-called values and the facts of life in the everyday world within which we operate. When these two worlds collide hard enough and often enough, a fire in the belly is sometimes ignited. The tension between the two worlds is the root of radical action for justice and democracy. Not radical as in looting or trashing, but as in going to the root of things. And the way to get to the root of things in this way of resistance is through relationships, specifically one-on-one relational meetings. This is what that whole organizing philosophy is about. My doctoral project a couple of years ago, this is what I did. I did a series of one-on-one relational meetings with parents of incoming 6th graders to see what I could learn about their life and the issues that they cared about. So here's another thing that he said in his book. He said, under Alinsky, organizing meant pick a target, mobilize, and hit it. Raise your hand if that resonates with your idea of like activism and how to resist. Pick a target, mobilize, and hit it. In the modern IAF, he said, it's connect and relate to others. Issues follow relationships. You don't pick targets and mobilize first. You connect people in and around their interests. The inspiration for most of the best public tactics I've ever created came from relational meetings. This is frustrating for people. When we were starting that chapter of the IAF, we had people who were ready to go day one. Like, here's the thing I care about. Let's do this, 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 and this. And what the organizer who was working with us said, well, who else do you know who also cares about that? What kind of relationships do you have, right? As a congregation participating in an IAF organization, the character of our relationships with each other was very, very important. We have a long-range plan that's talking about the need for connection and belonging. To me, those things serve the purpose of resistance. One of the things that feels really frustrating in a time like this, when you feel like we should be doing something, is we can feel isolated, like we don't really have relationships to mobilize, like a community that has said, we care about this thing, well in advance of the thing becoming an urgent priority so that when it does, the relationships can be activated and we can take action, right? Chamber's approach to resistance is you are always building relationships. And relationships with leaders in particular in this one-on-one style. He was pretty discriminating about who he would meet with. He was like, if you just want to complain about the problem, I don't want to meet with you. If you want to lead and be part of a solution and do stuff, like I got time for you. And a one-on-one relational meeting is 35, 40 minutes long. What do you care about? Who do you know? What are you good at? What are you willing to do? It's pretty compelling. And it's had a profound influence on how I think about resistance in a moment like this. Who are our relationships? And if they're lacking, how do we build them for the sake of resistance? Okay, it's 11:52. I have one more thing. Meredith's not here, so I won't try to do her story, but you should ask Meredith when you see her about her story with the Lincoln Square Moms Facebook group sponsoring a family of Syrian refugees in 2017. So questions, responses. Margaret had her hand up earlier. Do we need a microphone for questions? Yes. Okay, so people can hear on Zoom.
Thank you, but I think my question has been answered.
Oh, beautiful. Okay, Regan.
Thank you, Rocky.
I'm ready.
I have relationships. There are people in this room I know who are very interested in being activated, who would like to be activated through the church, me being one of them. But because the church is not active in resistance, I have gone outside the church to other Presbyterian churches to volunteer for what they are doing and to make it known that, you know, where I live, which is close to here, and that if ICE comes into the building across the street, you know, I've given them my phone number and said, you know, just call me 911. I'll come and get them. I know what to do. I've been trained. I know what to do. It would have been nice for me if that were true here. And I think you're naive in saying that that may not happen, because it may happen. Because our church is where the workers are, right? And they may show up here someday, like tomorrow, and we don't want to close the door, right? And we don't want to let ICE in. And there is a way for churches to do that, even with the current executive orders. There is a way for churches to do that. So that's one thing. So, and if anybody here would like to join me, you know, they can. And you should feel free to give anyone my name and number, email address, anything. At any rate, the other thing I want to say is the plan that the staff has, I don't know that plan. So I'm left thinking we're not doing anything.
Right.
I heard as I was coming in the door about something we're doing next Saturday morning or 2 weeks from now. I didn't know anything about that. I don't need to know anything about that, but I will come. But that's the first I've heard, and I'm not even sure what it was because I was just coming in the door, that this church was doing anything.
Sure.
Like I don't hear it from the pulpit, and hearing it from you today is the first time I've really heard we're concerned, we're doing something, you know, even though it's with a small group of people, it seems to be kind of a secret, whatever it is we're doing.
Well, I wouldn't say it's a secret. Well, first of all, thank you, because what I hear you saying is that there's value in the larger congregation knowing if we have made decisions about things or if we have intentions about things in this regard, because it makes you feel like it gives you an assurance that we're actually working on something. So our orientation about it was like, let's do the thing. Let's make sure the thing is in place. And it might be naive to think that nobody's going to actually come in here, but it's not totally naive because we have a plan. Like we know what we'll do if that happens. The other thing I want to say is you going and being involved elsewhere, you are also Fourth Church when you go and do those things, right? You know, the plan that we came up with was spurred on by Joe having gone over to Lincoln Park Presbyterian Church and participated in a training about what churches ought to do. We saw they were going to do that. We said, Joe, let's have you go to that, come back and report. And Joe led the kind of conversation about what that would look like for us. So the thing I want to say about relationships connected to what you said is the IAF and this organizing strategy is not just about individual one-on-one relationships, it's institutional relationships. So we as a church, we are an institution, and we have relationships with other institutions that care about the things that we do. And tending to those relationships matters as much as our tending to our relationships with one another. So I'm going to get this, you're next, but I want to give an example. So after October 7th happened a year and a half ago, we were thinking about how do we respond to this. I went to Nanette, and I said, Nanette, we have relationships with Muslim communities and Jewish communities. Let's hear from them. Let's have them tell us what this is like for them, and let's not do anything or make a statement or anything right away. Let's go to the relationships first. And Nanette did that, and I feel like that was kind of in this spirit and was the right thing to do. In the days ahead, I think we are going to have occasion to draw on our relationships with other communities and other institutions. So there was a question down front.
Let me just say, first of all, I appreciate Rocky and I appreciate Reagan and everybody that's trying to do the right thing. Second thing, I would like to know how we can know more about these confessions. I'm not sure that the church's other people are as interested as I am, because, you know, I just want to
They're
say
not, you're right.
the court, I have faith in the law, but the courts are not going to stop this, because the courts did not stop the president, and he has very savvy people working for him, as we all know. So I want to do the Christian thing and the constructive thing. I'd like to know more about how we can activate these confessions, follow our faith, and yet not be so passive to let these people run all over us. And Rocky, I appreciate a lot of the things you said. So will there be more seminars? I don't mean to make more work for you, believe me. Will there
Well,
be
you got
more?
the adult ed people in the room. This is
Will
like
there
a
be
request.
more seminars like the Saturday seminar you're given, where we can follow our faith, feel good about each other, develop our relationships, and yet not let people be so oppressed?
I think, yes, the next thing that's happening in 2 weeks, it's like an iteration after this class. There's been some energy that's come up here. And so Nanette has taken the lead in saying, all right, what's the next thing we can do about this? It'll be the Saturday morning thing. What comes out of that? We may iterate some other expression out of that. We're going to kind of follow it and see where it goes. I see Liz. Liz had a question. And then Yaudi, I see Ned. Sorry. Yeah.
This is maybe more of a statement, but I feel like we hear a lot coming out of Lincoln Park Presbyterian, and we don't hear enough coming out of Fort Church with, I mean, the programs they've been doing before the election, and I feel like we shy away from it. It's too controversial. And I like to see that we are the premier Presbyterian church. We are the light in the city. And why are we following their lead when it should be our lead?
You want us to be the big dog.
We are the big dog. Why are we acting like the lapdog?
Well, okay, so the former pastor of Lincoln Park Presbyterian Church is in the room, so I want to tread carefully. This may sound, I don't want this to sound like, first of all, yes. The second we saw that email from Beth, the pastor at Lincoln Park, we said, let's get connected to this. It's okay to let another church lead, I think. That doesn't mean that we sit back and do nothing. I've served small churches. Sorry? No, I understand. If you don't know, Lincoln Park Presbyterian Church, they did a remodel. There is an apartment in their church property for a refugee family. So they've dedicated part of their physical church structure to house asylum seekers and refugees. I've served a small church and I've served this church. Flexibility in a small church is a great advantage. When there are not as many people and structures and systems that you have to check in with before you do a major thing, that's not it's an organizational reality. And I hear you. It's 12:01. I'm going to defer to the adult ed folks. I'll stay up here and talk to people for 15 minutes before the adult ed or the congregational meeting. But Ted, what is your judgment?
That's what I would suggest, is that we continue informally, but it's only fair that we end on time, especially with the congregational meeting start at 12:15. So I know a lot of people want to say something, but
Yes.
so hang on if you can.
Well, thank you all for your attention and for this whole class. I really appreciate it. Thank you online.